was one of these big, kind of press days in a posh hotel in London.
Yeah.
And I was not only directing it, I was filming it on the main camera. And about 20 minutes before he arrived, I thought I'd lost the cards that you record the camera, the film on.
Yeah.
And I have never felt my blood run cold like that. And it was just a horrible 10 minutes. This Hollywood, but his mum's perseverance, she was convinced that his brain was active, and she proved him right. His brain is perfectly active, and he now communicates through his eyes. The only thing he can move is his eyes, and he wrote his autobiography with his eyes.
Wow.
And I just think, what? And then obviously to sort of shake his hand at the end of the interview and think, I've shaken the hand of a man who's shaken the hand of Elvis Presley. Wow. And you're not that far disconnected,
So, hello and welcome to Gospel Impacts, the podcast. Today we're speaking to somebody who has worked at the BBC for over 22 years. He's currently a producer, director on the Songs of Praise, having worked on this for many years and worked on Blue Peter also. He's also been a presenter on Radio 4's Daily Service. Apparently that's the longest running radio programme in the world. So it seems he is destined to only work on shows that are over 60 years old, despite being a hip and trendy 44-year-old. For those who are watching on video, you'll see how dashing he is. So hello and welcome to a great friend of mine, Dave Waters.
Hello. Hi, Al. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah.
No problems. If I'm honest, I'm a little intimidated, as this is your profession and you are the professional in the room. So I'm feeling a little bit under pressure interviewing somebody who's interviewed many, many more people than I have. So thank you for joining me.
Don't worry, my gifts are not in the technicals, so you're quite safe. I just rely on other professionals for those bits.
Great. Well, look, let's start the interview. As our listeners will find out, you've been a great friend of mine, but also a very interesting character and been through some interesting situations. So, without further ado, let's find out who you are. Who is Dave Waters growing up? Where did he grow up? And how and when did he become a Christian? What did you want to be when you grew up? I'll shut up now.
Yeah, good question. So so you'll know when it comes to sport that I have Welsh blood pumping through my veins. So mum and dad are both Welsh. Me and my brother and sister were all born in England, but we're proud of our Welsh heritage, especially when Wales do well, which has not been too good of late. But I was born in Cheltenham, and then when I was 5, we moved to Knutsford, where I currently live. I did go away briefly, but came back. So I grew up here in Cheshire, and I think there was a brief period where I wanted to be a farmer as a child. Then I found out how early you have to get up in the morning, and I really, to my embarrassment, really, even at university, I kind of just enjoyed doing what I was doing and hadn't really put much thought. And it was only at university when I started to panic, thought, gosh, I better start making some decisions, that the idea of television caught my eye. And I knew that the BBC Religion Department, even then, was one of the only departments that had moved to Manchester. So it was kind of close by, and I vaguely knew a few people. And so that's where I sort of set my sights. But how I became a Christian, do you know what? I think it's very easy when you grow up in a Christian home, and mum and dad set a brilliant Christian example, and we were always taken to church, but we were never forced to go to church. And we weren't really a very demonstrative family. Like, it wasn't like we were praying at home every day or even talking about very deep stuff. It's just not the way we are, really. We're very close, but we didn't really talk about that. So there was no kind of pressure, although I did have very good examples. But the turning point, I always think, is my mum brought me, those little sort of read the Bible, sort of young people's everyday Bible notes.
Yeah.
And at 11, I think my mum had them, and then she said, they do them for young people. And I was about 11, and she said, would you like me to get you one? And that was the only thing she said. She never checked up that I read it, but she just subscribed me from that moment. And I don't know what it was. Well, I do know what it was. I can only think it was God's hand on my life. But something compelled me at the age of 11 to read them every day. And I was I can remember that feeling, that urge. I didn't feel right unless I'd read it that day. And which at the age of 11 and a sort of football crazy boy, that's sort of a bit weird. And like I say, looking back, I can only think it was God's hand. And of course, that by the time I got to sort of 14, 15, I had a really pretty good kind of rudimentary understanding of the Bible, because I'd been reading little bits every day, and that had developed obviously into a very personal faith. And obviously church and weekends away and things like spring harvest had kind of given me like really boost moments, but that was the foundation. Still is, I think, the foundation, just getting to know the Bible and getting to know Jesus through that. And it's developed ever since.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So 22 years in the BBC, that's a long time, Dave. So where did it all start? How did it all start? And because it used to be the dream job working for the BBC. So I know when I found out that you got the job, it was, wow, that's really, really great. That he's been able to realize that. So how did it all begin?
Yeah, and we won't get into the politics of the state of the BBC now, but I can genuinely say I still think it is a dream job. I thank God every day really for a job that it really kind of, I think, fulfills a lot of my talents. I think it suits me, but it is a privilege to do it. And I've seen a lot of people who do want to get into this industry, and I do feel embarrassed, as I touched on a minute ago, that I didn't really. There's people I meet that this been their only goal for years, and I wouldn't say I drifted into it. It was a bit more deliberate than that, but it wasn't until I was at university, and I'd studied theology at university, and I loved doing that. But again, I hadn't done that with a view to getting a job from my degree. But like I said, I knew that the BBC religion department was up in Manchester, and I thought, well, maybe I'll give it a go. And BBC do a really good work experience scheme. So I applied the year I graduated, and I got that. It's a 4-week placement. And I'm so thankful they didn't put me in the religion department straight away. They put me in the entertainment department. And I ended up working on this brilliant, weird documentary that we were making for America. And it was literally like researching things like Yeti sightings and freak weather. And I was like, people get paid for this. This is brilliant. And also just the buzz around the building. And even then, looking back now, BBC Manchester at the time was a shadow of its former self, and it was before Media City had been built, way before. But I still felt there was this brilliant buzz about the place, and I applied for a job weirdly on Songs of Praise when I was work experience, and thinking I could do that, and didn't realize it was way above me. But the series producer was a very kind man, and he said, look, we can't even offer you an interview, but you're obviously enthusiastic, come and have a chat. And that led to more work experience, which then led to about 18 months when I never had more than 4 weeks on my contract, which sounds terrible, but I was loving it, and I was able to live at home, so it wasn't too bad. And then weirdly, the sort of beginning of the end of the story was I ended up getting my first proper job because of my degree. So having studied theology, never thinking I'd use it to earn my keep, I got my job as a specialist researcher on these big Bible documentaries, and I got it because of my degree, and that made me staff. And then I ended up working on all sorts of things in the years after. So yeah, and it's been a brilliant ride. One day I might have to get a proper job, but
so that's what a lot of people say. So obviously you've explained how you became a Christian, and now you're in the BBC, and now you're working for them. You're under contract, and but what have been some of the biggest challenges as a Christian, sort of working within or with the BBC?
Yeah, I like that question, and I think I understand why a lot of people ask it. I'm not sort of dodging it, but I don't feel like I've ever really found it that difficult. I mean, obviously, we live in a much more secular world these days, but even when, strangely, sometimes I find it working on religious programs, there's been times when you actually talk about faith less on religious programs because everybody's talking about it as the day job. It was actually when I went to children's and other departments that often people would speak about it more. I mean, yeah, I think there are challenges. but I hope I've just approached them in the right way, especially on Songs of Praise, because you could look at it as, we are obliged to reflect, parts of the church and different denominations and traditions that I might find very foreign or might even have some disagreements with. But rather than kind of think, oh gosh, I don't want to shine a light on that, I think God has gently just sort of rather opened my mind and sort of maybe gently knocked down some of my prejudices. And I've actually come to see God's working in all sorts of ways that perhaps I originally wouldn't have thought, because one week you're in a Catholic church or in a Pentecostal church or not in a church at all. And you suddenly see, oh, God's working there and he's working there. And actually my little box that I grew up in, God's work is so much wider than that. So yeah, there's been occasional challenges. I remember getting a few sniggers once where I pitched an idea about Christmas and some little snigger about it being fairy stories and who would believe that kind of thing. But I really haven't encountered that too much. And and obviously working in religious programs, a lot of Christian programs, often you're actually talking about that stuff most of the time. But it's so I don't know whether I think when the challenges have come, I think I've just tried to see them much more as a learning experience and trying to kind of keep an open mind about it. So I've never felt it's been too tough in that sense.
That's good. Well, I know a lot of our listeners, and I know I have faced some quite interesting challenges in my secular work. So it's actually nice to hear that obviously it's secular work, but it's also religious in its content. So that's interesting to hear. So in that time, obviously working with the BBC, you'll have met some pretty interesting people, some interesting celebrities. So I'd like to know who was your favourite and why. Who's your most challenging? Who was the biggest diva? Because I'm sure you've worked with a few divas. And which Christian celebrity that you've met do you admire the most and why? That's a big question. In fact, that's about 4 questions in one. So sorry.
No. I mean, I know this sounds really blasé, but because it stretches, and we don't, often a lot of the time, I'm not working with big names, and I'm genuinely saying this, it is often the ordinary people, the ordinary faith stories that really move you more. Yeah. But of course, everybody loves a bit of stardust. And actually, when I stop and think over the years, people I've met, you kind of go, gosh, I am being so fortunate, So Steve Carell sticks out when I'm on Blue Peter. And weirdly, none of the people were actually the problem. It was often either I created the problem or it was the people around them. So I was so frightened and so nervous, Steve Carell. It was one of these big, kind of press days in a posh hotel in London. Yeah. And I was not only directing it, I was filming it on the main camera. And about 20 minutes before he arrived, I thought I'd lost the cards that you record the camera, the film on. Yeah. And I have never felt my blood run cold like that. And it was just a horrible 10 minutes. This Hollywood star waiting. And anyway, they were still in my bag. I just panicked when I looked. I couldn't see them, and they were there. And it was great. But, I remember he was surrounded by sort of American men in suits. And they were all going like... looking at my monitor going, oh, his reflection in his glasses. And Steve Carell was just sitting there going, well, I could just lose the glasses. And they were like, no, Steve, you keep the glasses. We'll sort this. And I was like, it's always the people themselves are like chilled. So, I mean, he was brilliant to me. And Sir Ian McKellen, again, massive name.
Wow, massive name.
And he was brilliant. But again, I remember that with a chill, because again, nothing to do with him, but there was for some reason I had a crew. We were meeting him in Manchester, and the crew was coming from London. I can't remember why, because it was a stupid idea, and they got held up in a massive crash on the M6, and they just didn't make it. So I had Sir Ian McKellen in a room in Manchester, in a bar in Manchester, and his PA going, he's really looking forward to this interview. And I said, I'm really sorry, I haven't got a crew. And it was just horrible.
How did you get over that? How did you record it? What happened?
Al, it was horrible. And what happened was he was there for it was part of the Pride weekend in Manchester, and he was part of it. So he was there all weekend. And they were really kind, because his team could have easily just gone, well, stuff you, how unprofessional. But they said, well, he was actually really looking forward to talking to you. So keep in touch, and if he's got any other time in the weekend, we'll let you know. And by which time I'd booked had a Manchester cameraman on standby. And then on the Monday, it was a bank holiday weekend. I think on the Monday, I just got this call and they said, he'll give you half an hour. And I've drove into Manchester, met the crew. We set up in about 10 minutes and we got a really good interview. He was really interesting guy. But yeah, so we managed to, I've saved my bacon, because obviously we'd build this, it was for a Sunday morning show. But he was great. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, and it's embarrassing, but I've probably forgotten a lot. I work regularly with Catherine Jenkins now on Songs of Praise, and she definitely has a superstar lifestyle, but is lovely and very modest and great to work with.
Yeah.
But the people that stand out, I mean, I really admire people like Dan Walker, who's never, shied away from his faith, but just has an integrity about him that, and he's been super successful because he's brilliant at what he does, and he's not compromised on who he is. And I remember him saying once, I think the head of BBC Sport or something said, look, you'll never make it if you don't work on a Sunday, which is one of his principles. And of course he did, and it just it's great, so love people like Dan, because it is tough, especially when you're front of camera and you've got the eyes on you and people ask you much more questions that they'll ask of me or my faith. But yeah, I think there's lots of people that I would remember and admire. And I'm not just saying this to sound cheesy, but the people that really stick with me are not famous. They're just got the most extraordinary.
So, well, why not tell us one of those stories of who you have met, and whether they're Christian or not, but I
could tell you so many. And actually, I said this to someone the other day. Do you know all those intellectual arguments about the existence of God?
Yeah,
all brilliant. I really respect those. But the privilege of my job, I have heard, and I'm not kidding, hundreds of times, the testimony of someone saying, it's a variation of something like, I hit rock bottom, or that was it for me, and I cried out and Jesus saved me. And when you hear that time and time again, for me, it's not an intellectual proof, of course, but it's what a confirmation of faith that all over the country, all different kind of social situations, and you're meeting people saying that same testimony. It's amazing. But one that I'll share with you that probably sticks out the most is, and I still get quite emotional talking about it, is a lovely lad called Jonathan Bryant. And at the time we interviewed him, he was only 13, and he'd already written his autobiography. So Jonathan's mum was in a car accident when she was pregnant, and when he was born, they basically thought he was brain dead, and he can't move his limbs. But his mum's perseverance, she was convinced that his brain was active, and she proved them right. His brain is perfectly active, and he now communicates through his eyes. The only thing he can move is his eyes, and he wrote his autobiography with his eyes.
Wow.
And I just think, what? And but this is what his mum told the story of when she first realized he could speak and communicate. He kept talking about a garden.
Right.
And he said, when can I go back to the garden? And she was like, this is him as a small child. And he said, she said, what do you mean the garden? He said, Jesus' garden. And he'd nearly died a few times and had very near-death experiences. He said, I've been to this garden. He said, I love going there because I can run and climb trees. And then, and she said, how do you know it was Jesus' garden? And he said, because he was there. I met him, and I'm going to go back there, but I think Jesus wants me to stay with my family for a bit longer. And I just, and that is a child telling you that. There's no way he has made that up, or, and, to hear stories like that, and you just, oh, man, so what a privilege to shine a little light on, for the thing it does for my faith, and then to have the privilege of sharing it on TV or wherever. It's just, Brilliant.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I've done this podcast.
Yeah.
Is exactly that. The amount of stories I've heard now has been just incredible, and it's meant so much to me. So I'm hoping to get a similar blessing and privilege that you guys that you've had, because that's been incredible. But thank you for sharing that. I know how hard.
You can check out
sounds
his
incredible.
book. It's called I Can See, and it's I as in EYE. I Can See is Jonathan's book. It's brilliant.
So Jonathan, what was his surname?
Bryant.
Jonathan Bryant. So yeah, if you want to pick up that book, sounds very interesting. So obviously you've met some amazing people, and you're now working on songs of praise. And my original question was: is this just for people over the age of 80? What do you think is an offer for us below 80 in this program? And what are some of the craziest things that have happened on Songs of Praise? But deal with that second. Maybe first one, why Songs of Praise, and why is it relevant to us as Christians today?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And we'd be the first to admit, people, the team is a really great bunch of people. It's a real mix of people. And we would be the first to say, our hardest challenge is image and perception, because people hear Songs of Praise, and we've been on 62 years. So we all know it. You'll know it. Almost everybody can picture a scene of like they're at home on a Sunday night. They've got to do their homework, and the Songs of Praise theme tune like triggers this thing. And they're like, but if they've ever watched it, they sort of, I say it's like, oh, it's just grannies singing hymns. That's what they picture. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the grannies singing hymns. And of course, we're very realistic. Our core audience still is that sort of slightly older, more traditional, who want their sort of favorite hymns. But a lot of the time when we get criticism, especially from younger Christians, it's because people haven't watched us.
Yeah.
And yes, of course, we still do the traditional things, but it has evolved massively. We do take great, and even in the stories that we tell, yes, there's a lot of tradition. There's a lot of history, because people love to see where we are, because we're all around the country every week. But there's testimony. There's, we are a Christian program. We've never been ashamed of that. We've never shied away from it. We celebrate the Christian faith, hopefully as broadly as we can. And so you get great testimony on there, like I've already said. And the music, we do such a wide variety of music now. And we do, a gospel choir of the year. We do a young chorister of the year. So, and we've changed. I think we're in a format now where it's the kind of best hybrid we can offer. Because years ago, what used to happen is we do modern worship, for example, or gospel, but you'd only do it like once every 5 weeks. So all the traditional audience would suddenly get like, whammo, like a whole episode of modern worship, and they'd all write in saying how they hated the happy clappy stuff. And all the people who preferred modern worship weren't watching anyway, because they thought we were traditional. So now what we try to do, and we don't get it right every week. Of course, we can't please everybody, but there's an authenticity to Songs of Praise that I've grown to love. And we try to get a balance in every episode now between traditional music and modern, and across the year we do a huge variety of things. We'll do the pomp and ceremony of the coronation and things like that, but we'll also we'll be in the food banks, and we'll be in the churches that are helping the homeless, and so and everything in between. So I hope that we can start to change perceptions. And I made a program. One of our presenters, Sean Fletcher, is a wonderful man. We're doing these occasional programs of their testimony, call it their faith journey. And I did Sean's earlier this year. Was it last year? I can't remember. And we've never had more social media comments on a program. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds. And what was really interesting was loads of them were, I haven't watched Songs of Praise for 20 years, but you've got to watch this one, or like tell your congregations to watch this.
Right.
Try to work out what it was. And I think it was because Sean's a really lovely guy, but also he had a genuine faith journey. He didn't grow up a Christian. He came to faith at school, fell away, came back to it. So there was a real journey there, and he was just really honest. It was an honest testimony. And I think it just hit a chord that people thought that's not what Songs of Praise did. And when they found that we did do that, they were like, oh wow, and this is on BBC One. This is on,
Yeah.
like so. And it was I just think things like that. Like I said, we don't get it right every week, but I would really encourage Christians all across the UK, give it a try occasionally. Every episode's on iPlayer for a year now, and there's some really good stuff in there. And it is, let's face it, it's a minor miracle we're still on. But thank God for the BBC. There's no other network in the world, mainstream network, that would put this stuff on.
No.
So it is.
Well, I think it's a blessing, Dave, that on BBC One in a pretty prime time spot is people singing about Jesus, and that can't be a bad thing. And then also, if there's testimonies on there of how Jesus has met them and had an impact on their lives, that for me has got to be a positive. So I maybe I need to start switching on on Sunday nights.
Like I say, especially with iPlayer now, because we're on at lunchtime. Obviously, there's challenges. It's not the 1980s when we're on in the evening and 6 million people are watching. It's not that. Those days have gone for every program. But we still have a very healthy audience. We still have an amazing reach, and a lot of people writing in saying, I've been to church in decades, but I'll always watch Songs of Praise.
Brilliant.
And I think so. It's good news television. I think it's it's a blessing to work on, definitely.
So what has been the craziest thing that happened on Songs of Praise? Think of something that you behind the scenes, behind the curtain, behind the blue rinse.
Oh man. I mean, there's quite a lot. I mean,
I've actually been on Songs of Praise, I might add, about 3 times. But anyway,
have you? There we are. Fame. No, it's. we get a lot of that thing of like people going, oh well, the churches are never full every Sunday, and suddenly they're full for Songs of Praise. And in our defense of that, actually, we've always, for 60 years, we've always invited the whole town.
Right. Okay.
That was never really a legitimate criticism. We've always been open about it. But oh man, there's been so many. I remember Aled Jones getting told off for whistling in a church. How dare he whistle in the house of God? I think he was whistling a hymn tune as well. There was one story where I've got to be careful what I share now. But there's been quite actually it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of not, that actually, because there's obviously lots of non-Christians who work on Songs of Praise, and you actually realize how important it is of the example that we give as Christians, because they see good and bad. And that's the pity is, and I remember getting absolutely yelled at by a vicar because we'd interviewed the organist of the church, and the organist had keys to the church. And so I never thought, kind of my fault, but we never thought to mention it to the vicar, because it was all through the organist and she had keys to the church. About a few days later, she rang up demanding thousands of pounds, and how dare we go into her church and shouting at our team, which is not a great impression. No. It was all sorted out in the end. I think she just got a bit hurt by it, but yes, there are some. I'm sure I could think of far more, and some maybe.
Well, they sound pretty crazy moments for me. Yeah. But I think sort of one of the benefits of working for BBC, Dave, is that you're able to get hold of things that other people might not. Now, you might be thinking, what the heck is he saying here? Why is he going here? What is he on about? Well, one of the most special things that I've done, and certainly for me, was you got us tickets to see Glenn Campbell at the Lowry. It was his last tour ever. He was mega special to my dad. My dad loved Glenn Campbell. And Glenn actually had early stage dementia, as I thought my dad was starting to get when I went with him. But we were able to sit there. In fact, I think, I want to say Sarah Lancashire, I think it was, was sat literally right behind us. So, which was quite interesting. And I think she was actually either she's going out with or somebody very senior in the BBC at the time.
She's married to Peter Salmon, who was the head of BBC Door.
That's right. He was also sat there. Yeah. So and I remember that that was massive for me, because Unfortunately, both of them, my dad and Glenn Campbell, took a rapid decline in their dementia. But I'll never forget my dad's face when we heard sort of Rhinestone Cowboy, which, if you don't know Glenn Campbell, is probably one of his most famous songs. So firstly, I wanted to say on this podcast a huge thank you for that gift. And it really does mean a lot to me for what you did for us. But it was a great concert, and I'll never forget that album that he released last, which I still have, and it still brings tears to my eyes when I listen to some of the songs that he sang, because he obviously had early stage dementia then, even when he was recording that album. So but this is a long way around to a question, and a bit indulgent for me to share thank you with you, but I know you interviewed Glenn and his wife, but what were some of the things you didn't know about Glenn maybe beforehand, before that interview, and what did you find most interesting about him, or even them?
Yeah, it was special memories. And again, I said this so many times, but it was such a privilege to have this job, because opportunities like that, don't come to many people. And I since found, actually, after that in the 80s or 90s, they'd actually done a whole Songs of Praise from Glenn Campbell's ranch in America. This is when they had limitless budget. So he's had this great sort of Christian faith through his life, and obviously, I mean, at times one of the biggest stars in the world, and certainly one of the greatest guitar players who's ever lived. And I don't think I knew enough about that. So that was a big thing for the interview, because he was basically part of this band called the Wrecking Crew, who were basically the best session musicians of the day, who played through the 50s and 60s on anyone and everyone hit record. They got these guys in. This is way before Glenn Campbell was famous, and I love that. I mean, it's really, I love early rock and roll. It's one of my favorite periods of music. So to be able to talk to this man, and it was in some ways sad, because his dementia had started and he needed his wife next to him, because she would just prompt him, and then she only needed to prompt, and then he was off. And I asked him about Elvis, and he sort of looked blank. Elvis, and his wife sort of just went, you played for Elvis, and he went, oh yeah. And then suddenly he started saying how him and Elvis would stay up all night, singing gospel songs and talking about Christianity, and how he played the riff on Viva Las Vegas. I was like, that's you?
Wow.
That. And he was like, yeah, I played on Viva Las Vegas. And it's just like, oh. And then I could see, to sort of shake his hand at the end of the interview and think, I've shaken the hand of a man who's shaken the hand of Elvis Presley. Wow. And you're not that far disconnected, no. And yeah, I mean, and interestingly as well, and this is what I love, and this is, I think, what I've learned, is a lot of people's testimonies are not neat and tidy. No. Well, none of us are we? We are a mad mix of flaws and failures saved by grace. And he had a real problem with alcoholism, right, through a lot of his life. And it was quite a funny moment in the interview, because his wife said how she'd been praying to meet a godly man, and then she ended up on this date with Glenn Campbell, and he prayed before the meal, and she was like, oh, thank the Lord, my prayers are answered. And then she said, then I found out he had a terrible drinking problem. At which point Glenn Campbell went, it wasn't terrible, I had a great time. And but so he had this difficult relationship with alcohol, where in some ways it gave him fire in the belly, but then became a real problem, and then got help and got sober and things, but and still had this great faith. So yeah, I mean, what a great privilege to talk to someone like that, and may you rest in peace.
Yeah, amazing man. I know I had a deep faith in the end, so yeah, it made it even more poignant. But so obviously you've met Glenn Campbell, you've met lots of other people, but is there anyone left on the bucket list you'd like to meet, and what would be the best question you'd like to ask him?
It's got to be Bruce Springsteen. Right. I would love to meet Bruce. I was very, very fortunate. Just 3 weeks ago, Lisa, my wife, and I went to see him at Villa Park, and I went there, Al, and we'd booked the tickets, you know how it is, like over a year earlier, and I'd seen him before, but quite a few years ago, and I love Bruce's his songs, and then as we were driving there and we were held up in traffic and it was getting late, and then I was starting to doubt, he's 73 now, are we going to see a sort of famous rock star just on the down, is his powers waning? And honestly, it was the best concert I have ever seen. If that man is 73, I'm 103. But it was also, and I mean this sincerely, it was also the most spiritual experience I've had all year.
Wow.
Because, and I think this is part of what God has taught me about keeping an open mind. Like, he's so much bigger than we can ever pigeonhole. And God definitely uses people like Bruce Springsteen. I mean, he actually is, in page 1 of his autobiography, he calls himself a follower of Jesus,
right.
Which is like, wow, I wasn't really expecting. I mean, I knew he uses faith in his lyrics, like he tells these amazing stories and he's talking about redemption and grace and second chances and things like that. But I didn't realize it was so important to him. But I would love to talk to Bruce, and I'd love to ask him, how he defines that as a follower of Jesus and how he's managed, even though he's a gazillionaire, he still seems to have kept some authenticity. He still writes for the kind of working class heroes in the States, or and he just seems to. And I was looking around at the crowd, and it was incredibly varied crowd as well, old and young, and and like people who kind of brought with him, and it was just, and if you don't mind me sharing it very quick, finishes with just like they switched the stadium lights on for the last like 40 minutes, and it's just like, so when he's singing Dancing in the Dark, we're dancing in the light, and it was just sensational, and the atmosphere was brilliant. Then the very last song, all the band went off and he came on, and this is the amazing thing about Bruce, even his new stuff, like, it's not all about just playing the old hits. His new stuff is just amazing. And he sang a song called I'll See You in My Dreams, just him and a guitar. And basically his latest album is all about, he's realized he's outlived a lot of his friends and he's lost a lot of his friends. And this song just wouldn't leave me. And Lisa and I just kind of held each other, because it's about kind of, the lyrics are like, I'll see you in my dreams when all our summers have come to an end, up around the river bend, because death is not the end, and it's a brilliant song. And it stayed with me. And I was preaching. I'm a Methodist local preacher. That's another thing I don't know if we said it up front. I was preaching in a little church in Cheshire on the Sunday. So we saw Bruce on the Friday, and I was preaching on the Sunday. And I don't know why, I just couldn't get this song out of my head. And so I just used it. I just read the lyrics in the sermon, and it was probably only about 30 people there. And I was thinking, am I just doing this because I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan, and I was just, because I'm really buzzing after the concert. And a lady took me aside at the end and she said, do you know the couple on the front row? And I said, well, yeah, I see them every time I preach here. She said they lost their teenage daughter on this day 33 years ago. She said, wow. They never usually come on the anniversary, but they came today because they thought there would be a message for them.
Wow.
I was like, and
wow.
I just read and so I just think that is God using Bruce Springsteen. That is God using me. That is, and he speaks in so many ways more than we think he does. Circumstances and poets and preachers and songs and church and everything else, but God finds a way.
Yeah, absolutely. in all kinds of ways, and even using Bruce Springsteen, which is incredible. I was going to ask you what his killer question is, but it's kind of you've kind of answered a lot of that in that answer.
Yeah,
so
I think
no, that's absolutely fine. But what I want to ask is an even bigger question to you. Really, is what difference does your faith make in your life, both personal and work wise? I
think when you've been a Christian quite a while, like you and I both have, it in a good and a bad way, sometimes it becomes so much part of you. It's hard to kind of work out what difference it makes. What would we be like did we not have faith? And I don't know, to be honest. I just hope. Well, certainly, I'm privileged to work on Christian material, and that it makes a huge material in my work and songs of praise. It makes a huge difference because obviously, loads of brilliant people work on songs of praise, and not all of them have faith, and they can be fantastic at their job. But there's a point of understanding, I think, a sort of depth that you can only go to if you really faith kind of speaks to faith, and I think. So I think that really helps me in my job, that I understand what people are talking about if they're talking about an experience or their faith, whatever different expression that is. It might be from a totally different tradition to me, but you can understand and you can connect. I think for me personally, I think it just actually maybe I'll just use my wife as a better example. My wife works in the NHS, and you don't think you're anything exceptional, but I know that the love she knows in Jesus, and the kind of the commands, the inspiration to love our neighbors and to love those who we don't necessarily even like, I know she puts that into action, and she thinks it's normal, but it stands out. The fact that she speaks to hundreds of people every day. People walk into the hospital, and all walks of life, and she treats them all the same. And I hope maybe I've got a little bit of that as well, that actually those the spirit of Jesus and loving our neighbor hopefully shines through a little bit in the way that we treat people. And goodness knows, I falter and fall, and I'm as selfish as the next person, but hopefully a bit of his light shines, and that shines in a bit in the way we are with people, with the way we treat people, and hopefully in the integrity with which we work and things like that. But I hope it does anyway, despite my
it comes over, Dave, for me, just in your smile and your vigor for life is what it comes over for me. Jesus definitely shines through you. I've seen it, and I can tell you it does. No. So from all of that, sort of wrapping up and bringing the interview to a close, a tradition that we've stolen from another podcast, but don't tell anyone, is to leave a question for the next guest of that I can use, partly because I'm rubbish at questions, but is to leave for a particular guest that sort of a final question. Now, what I've negated to do is to tell Dave who that next guest is, which I normally do at the start of the podcast, but I'm going to tell him via a method on Zoom that hopefully doesn't pop up for those who are watching this on Zoom. But I'm going to tell him exactly who that person is, and then he'll be able to think of a question of what that might be. But he actually knows this person quite well. So, well, I think he does. He knows him fairly well. But we're interviewing him about his career of this particular person. So, when he was in his secular career. So hopefully that I've been as coy as I can be to try and pass on what I'm meaning by that. But so I just wanted to leave a question for that person, so that when I'm in that podcast, I can ask that question and carry on this tradition. So, Dave, what was you? I've hopefully padded enough time for you to have of a question for him.
I would say, what single person or experience has changed your faith most?
Wow.
So not the person who brought you to faith, but since you've been a Christian, what experience or person has changed your faith most?
Wow. Big question. That's a very good question. See, that's why I asked that at the end of the podcast, so you can help me out. So that's brilliant. But Dave, listen, thank you so much for taking the time out. I know how busy you are. And you not necessarily got the time to do this, so thank you for doing it.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Alan. Thanks for doing what you do.
No worries. Well, hopefully this will carry on and grow, and we can get more people hearing about the impact it has on the gospel. We've already had somebody who was impacting the gospel in their sort of later life, and now we've spoken to Dave, who has been a Christian for a long period of time. So I think it's nice transition from somebody who's had an incredible experience in terms of a conversion experience to somebody who is living out the Christian life. And I know, speaking to a person recently and interviewing a person recently who said he deeply admires those people who've stayed with the faith for such a long time. He's only been a Christian for sort of 5 or 10 years, and it's had an incredible impact on his life. But he always says he admires people who, like myself and others, who've been a Christian for a very long period of time, for sticking with the faith and running the race. So I hope you'll carry on, Dave. I hope you'll keep running that race, and we'll keep praying for you in your position, and which is an incredible one and a real privilege by the sounds of it. And we hope you'll have some great times moving forward. But thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thanks, Al. Absolute pleasure.
Yeah.